What if the Bible didn't just speak to your faith, but reshaped how you live in the world? The Anabaptist Community Bible invites you to read Scripture through the lens of Jesus, centered on peace, community, and radical discipleship. With insightful commentary from a diverse community of voices, it helps you engage Scripture in ways that are both deeply personal and powerfully communal. Whether you're studying alone or with others, this is a Bible designed to transform how you follow Jesus. Get 20% off your copy today at menomedia.org with code SHIFTING. Discount expires May 15th, 2026. The Anabaptist Community Bible. Read together, live differently.
The rain will come. The small cloud will occur, but it's not going to come from your effort. It's not going to come from your control. It's going to come as pure gift. And so the question is, are our communities prepared to receive the gift of God's presence, the gift of God's act? Or are we thinking we got to get our capital in order and we got to find ways? I mean, there's a certain way that capital itself becomes its own God, because capital can grow itself. Like what do we all want? We want our 401ks to have enough principal in them that they just grow without having to do anything. They're self-perpetuating forms of growth. And this is where we're kind of trapped, because none of us can really retire without fiscal capitalism and its growth markets. But at the same time, it does start to form us in a way to think money is more powerful than God. Capital is more powerful than God, because it acts, and your God waits and waits and waits until you are in deep need, and then reveals God's self and saves.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we could make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Andrew Root is back on the podcast to explore how ancient fertility idols still shape the way we think about growth, and how that logic has quietly taken hold in the church. We've inherited a vision of growth that assumes more is always better. More people, more influence, more momentum. And in that pursuit, it's easy to trade the way of Jesus for strategies that promise results. We talk about his new book, Baal and the Gods of More, and how the ancient pull toward fertility gods isn't as distant as we think. In a culture and a church driven by more, bigger, and better, Andy names the ways we've absorbed that logic. Whether it shows up in innovation, influence, or identity, we're often chasing growth in ways that don't look like Jesus. We walk through the stories of Elijah and Mary, from cultural analysis to the practices that shape our lives. This is about learning the difference between growing something and being formed into someone, into Christ. If you feel the pressure to produce, to scale, to prove your worth, this conversation offers a different vision of faithfulness. So join us. Here is my conversation with Andrew Root. Andy, welcome back to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you back on.
Great to be back.
I'm excited to dive into, I don't know if I'm going to say Baal or Baal, but one of the two, because you could pronounce them both ways. So Baal and the Gods of More, your new book. So you actually talk through this Canaanite fertility god as a representation of what is kind of happening now when we are pursuing growth in the church. Why does Baal really come forth? Why is this God something that we want to look at as reminiscent of what's happening now?
Yeah, well, first, I'm deeply insecure about the title, because it seems like I'm trying to cosplay an Old Testament scholar or something, you know what I mean? So there's no ground broken here in Near Eastern religion or, Old Testament scholarship or anything like that. So it sits within the vein of my larger project, which is to kind of do kind of cultural philosophy and continue to build a kind of pastoral ministry. But what I'm interested here in is really what's growth and what's growth all about. And, there's something endemic to being, I think, late modern, that we have a certain view of growth. I mean, I think we always do. I think cultures always give us a kind of interpretive framework for what we think is growth, and growth usually has something interconnected with some kind of moral sensibility of what's good. And so I think we have a particularly interesting one. And this book was really born being in Israel, being in Jerusalem right before. I mean, we were in Jerusalem, I guess it was January before the attack that happened in October. So, it was like 9 months or whatever before that. And we were in the Israel Museum, I guess it's called, Israeli Museum, and looking at all these like fertility bale, like they had these bales, like these clay bales, and it was just really shocking to me. First of all, because they were so old, and like you're thinking, my gosh, Elijah was walking around these parts of the world when people had these things in their homes or whatever, and so then we went to Rome. We were taking our kids kind of around as my son was graduating. And then you're in like the Renaissance art wing, and you're like, this stuff's so new compared to what we just saw. But I became really enamored with the thoughts of Baal as this fertility god, and then the pictures of the Madonna and the child, and thinking like those are two very different conceptions of what it means to grow. Like one is this sense that Israel's on a kind of downside of a golden era, which seemed to really resonate with me with a lot of the institutions I'm part of in Protestantism. Everyone kind of feels like we're on the downside of a golden era. Like, our seminaries used to be so strong in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s, and our congregations were full. Our denominations were so strong, and we've lost, half our members over the last 30 or 40 years. And so there seems to be a parallel to me in First Kings and Second Kings with kind of, again, playing this kind of cultural idea with American Protestantism, and this kind of sense that we're on the downside of a golden era. And I think when you're on the downside of a golden era, you become very tempted to seek fertility gods. And I think that's one of the points of that text. So I'm trying to do a kind of theological read next to a kind of cultural analysis that looks at First and Second Kings related to our kind of cultural moment, and asks a really big question of like, what is growth and what's growth about? And can pastors really concern themselves with growth, or shouldn't they concern themselves with growth? Like those questions are kind of what I'm after in this weird titled book.
But it's great. I mean, you talk about Hartmut Rose's dynamic stabilization, which is constant escalation, moving forward, constant growth. And I think the churches like took that on of like, hey, we need constant growth or else we're in decline. Just walk us through what that is for like the economy. We think about it, the economy, but how did the church take that on too?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting element that I've been trying to kind of work out, and yeah, I mean, it's showed up in a couple other places in my work, which I really think Rose is right. And his bigger point is that you are in a modern society, or you're modern when you stabilize your society dynamically. And he really means that when you stabilize your society by growth. And so there is something that's just fundamental to being a human being and being a cultural, social human being, that you always have to stabilize your society. And you shouldn't be part of any society that doesn't want to stabilize itself, or, any cultural form or collective that doesn't want to stabilize itself. I mean, we are contingent historical beings. So what keeps our practices, what keeps our ways of life going across time? And every society has to figure that out. Every society has to figure out what keeps them stable. And I think one of the realities of being in this kind of secular age as late modern people is what we have conceded to, or what the structures of our society lead us to believe is what stabilizes us, is escalating growth. It's growth of more resources. I mean, ultimately, we would sum this up to growth of more capital. And obviously capital means money, but it also means relevance. It also means, like social forms of social capital. It means just the sense of being able to kind of have capital and grow capital is what stabilizes you in all of its kind of cultural and economic forms. And I think it's really hard then for all forms of faith, and I think particularly Christianity, to escape that escalatory logic. Partly, in some ways you can't, because you're modern, like we're modern, and none of us can just press a button and no longer be modern. So this kind of escalating growth is just, in the ether, it's in the air we breathe. But there's other ways that it just kind of sets us up and forms us for idolatry. And that's what I'm trying to at least analyze in this book a bit.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com. And with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. I mean, you talk about two different idols, then the techno-optimism that we have on one side and the identitarianism on the other side. So because we want to, pursue this growth, constant escalation, we see those idols. What are these idols on either side?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying, I've entered into talking with economists in this book too, so there's always this, I'm trying to be interdisciplinary when I do this work. So this has taken me to some conversations with economists, and one of those economists is this Catalonian sociologist. But his basic point is that, like, first of all, like, this escalatory growth comes from industrialization. So once you enter into industrial society, then you enter into kind of escalating forms of growth. In other words, you have to kind of keep feeding machines, and that worked really, for the most part, pretty well for us in the first industrial revolution and in the second industrial revolution. When you think of kind of steam and then to electricity, like, we got a lot of standard of living growth out of that. But the third industrial revolution, he calls this the kind of digital, the kind of microprocessor industrial revolution, and it hasn't brought the same kind of growth. And one of the things it has produced, though, is inside what he calls this networked industrial revolution, is it tends to do this strange thing that we all live with now, is it turns personality itself into capital. And these kind of capitalist forms of escalation move more than kind of structures and machines, move into personality. And so the platform, the network, becomes a perfect place to do that. And what I'm trying to expose here, and this is a bit controversial, I think some people will be a little annoyed with me on this, is that inside this decline narrative that we take in, or inside this kind of vulnerability of dynamic stabilization, the two responses I see very clearly across both evangelical and mainline Protestant communities are either to become techno-optimists and essentially say there's some technology that can get us out of this. And we don't necessarily, we might mean that as AI or something, but we also mean that in the church as like, there's some program, there's some new form of preaching, there's some new kind of strategy that can do this. And, I think we've talked on this podcast about our addiction with innovation. Then, like, we turn pastors and say, you have to be an innovator, or your church, your denomination will go down. And then the other side of this, so you have those folks, and I think they're littered and dominant in some denominations and some structures and some networks. But then there's a whole other group that are kind of identitarians, and they believe they're kind of more activist in their kind of drives, and are really wanting to have discourse about identity issues, and identity issues are kind of driving reality. And Castile's this guy I'm drawing from, this Catalonian sociologist, says, like, identity becomes a really important reality inside of this third industrial revolution. This networked reality, identity becomes, really significant. In this kind of 3-volume work, he's laid that out. And I see that playing itself out. What I'm trying to expose that will probably make me no friends and make everyone hate me is I'm trying to say both sides are actually, interestingly, capitalist. Like they're escalatory growth on both sides. I mean, one is kind of escalatory growth in kind of classic ways. If we can find the innovation, we can find the people, we can find the relevance, we can grow this. The other side is like, if we can just escalate recognition for the right kind of identities, then the church will become an attractive community to people, or Christianity will become more culturally aware and therefore more relevant. And I'm skeptical of both, and partly because I'm, a theologian of the cross. So any forms of escalatory growth I start to worry about, because the very form God takes to reveal God's self most fully is a event that looks anything like escalatory growth, but looks like ultimate failure that saves the world. So so I'm trying to make that point in living in the main line with a lot of identitarians who want to be anti-capitalists. I see that the way they function online is completely an escalatory growth capitalist, growing kind of recognition capital becomes the game. And so so I'm going to make no friends from this book. So you're probably the last person who will talk to me after reading this book.
But I love this, because I mean it actually then informs the idolatries in our heart, that it's not really, and we try to get out of it, right? So with identity, we're trying to get out of it some way, but we're still in it. We're still on this hamster wheel of capitalism and growth and scaling more and more and more. And we just need people to recognize this, and we're going to actually have our moments. Can we get out of this hamster wheel? Like, is it something, I want to know, how do we recognize that specific God? I believe Paul when he says that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we do wrestle against the principalities, the authorities.
Yeah.
Like, there is a power that be. Do you think it's like a complete modern age, or is it particularly American Christianity as maybe a God that is trying to deceive us?
Well, what I think is particularly American, and I'm with you. I think now we're going to even make more people think we're weird, but I do think that these are fundamentally issues of spirit. Like, these are spiritual issues that are at stake here, and because they're deeply moral issues of what it means to be kind of aimed towards the good, what it means to be possessed by a narrative and a story that frames our lives. What I think is particularly American about this is that the other economist that I deal with in this book is this kind of grumpy economist that I think is brilliant, but is very grumpy, is this guy by the name of Robert Gordon, who wrote this huge, thick book, which, now I'm addicted to big, huge, thick books. Like, those are the books I like to read. But this big book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And his basic point, this is why he's so grumpy. His basic point, this is the positive piece of it. He says, like, that there was unprecedented growth for America, for the West, but really for America, that creates the American century from 1870 to 1970. Like, just unbelievable amounts of GDP growth that lead to just huge forms of standard of living growth. And what makes him grumpy is he can show statistically that this ended in 1970. Like, it has not. We have not seen the same amount of growth that we did in those 100 years. And he thinks those 100 years were a unique 100 years. He calls this the special century that we just had because of the distributions of the first two industrial revolutions. It just led to huge forms of standard of living growth. Changes. This is one of my points on this is why people in the early 1960s thought the Jetsons was a documentary. I mean, it just seemed logical that we were going to have flying cars because, if you were born in 1860 and you made it to 1940 or 1950 or something. I mean, the way, this is why Back to the Future works too, because 55 and 85 are pretty different, but you go 30 years, and whatever, 30 years, what's that, 05 or something like that, it's not that different. Like 85 and 05 is not that different, but 55 and 85 are huge difference. And that's because 55 to 85, you're right in the middle of the huge standard of living growth of this unprecedented GDP growth. But my point is, like, what's uniquely American is that our GDP growth and standard of living just took off in those 100 years. But then American Protestantism, and I think this is different than Europe, American Protestantism just seems to thrive when GDP growth is up. Like people just start looking for churches when their standard of living is going up. And I don't think that correlates the same way, say in Europe. So we have this thing we call, we call it the Christian century. And there's a publication called the Christian Century, but this was all, this was a mission statement, the Christian century. And it really was the Protestant century. It was very un-Catholic, it didn't really care about Catholics. The Christian century meant the Protestant century. And so what I'm pointing out in this book is like the special century and the Christian century they almost are completely overlap. But once 1970 happens, mainline Christianity all of a sudden feels the same decline. So once the economy starts to implode, I think evangelicalism comes in the 1970s, and they are evangelicals, and the neo-evangelicals that came out of World War II are much more, they're better positioned to deal with the headwinds. They're more entrepreneurial. They're less embedded in kind of structures that were built during the special century. They had a bit of being kind of outsiders within that, and that allowed them to have to respond well. And if we want to talk in this language, win the escalatory battles from 1970 to say 2010. Like conservative Protestants become the Protestant expression, because they can deal more with low GDP, low standard of living that mainline Christianity just hasn't. So there's something uniquely American about this. But then there's some of the ways we think about growth that I think are pretty standard, global, at least affected by globalization, but are, embedded in Western imaginations, I think.
I mean, we could see these things happen, but how do I recognize that I'm following an idol and I'm not following Christ, like in our churches?
Well, this is where I want to transition our imaginations about growth, like to say it really bluntly, we are really formed to think about growth. Or let's just start with this and say that I think there is something inherent within Christianity where growth is important. Like I'm not trying to be a anti-growth person, but I think within the theological traditions are broadly, Protestant as well as just overall the Christian theological tradition, growth has been growth into someone and not growth of something. And so there's a deep sense of what it means to grow into Christ, what it means to take the form of Christ, be conformed to Christ, as opposed to growing something. And I think, especially as Protestants, we should be very aware of that because, our Reformation starts in the kind of mixing up in a more cultic way than a kind of capitalist way, but kind of mixing up the growth of something as opposed to the growth of the cultic reality, even, as opposed to the growth into someone. And so I try to use like the picture of Artemis, so I transition from like these like Baal as in, First and Second Kings to Artemis of Ephesus, who we had this like very Saturday Night Live experience in the Vatican Museum. I'll just tell you this story. We were with so we had our two kids. We took them out of school. It was Owen's senior year, and it was still some kind of COVID restrictions or something, or I don't know. The Vatican Museum was basically saying if you want to come in, you have to do a tour. We're not selling tickets. This was 23, so we booked a tour with this ended up being this gruff Italian woman that her voice sounded like. Well, we actually walked up on her as we gathered, hotboxing a couple cigarettes, and you could tell it was just like espressos and cigarettes was what she lived on. And so we show up, and we happen to be all Americans, two Spanish people and all Americans, and they're all homeschoolers from Denver. And there's a group of these Americans. And so the Spanish folks, as soon as we get into the Vatican, they ditch us. I don't know if they just hated the thought of being with Americans, or were just like using the tour to get in the door, and then we're going to do their own thing. But we end up down the Greek kind of Hellenistic wing of the Vatican tour, and we come to Artemis. And if people have seen this picture, Artemis kind of stands with her hands open, and she's covered in these kind of spherical kind of things. And one of the homeschool mom goes, "Oh, are those eggs? Are those eggs all over? They kind of do look like eggs." But the gruff Italian tour guy goes, no. And she was like looking for the English word. She's like, no, those are, no, those are teats. Those are teats. And this poor homeschool mom just was so deeply embarrassed now, like turning red. And, but that is kind of the point is, like this fertility God is almost depersonalized to just give you resources, like to just extract resources from it. And it's a growth of more of that, more of these resources, where you can see how we can become addicted to that as church leaders. But then, like I said, you go down to the Renaissance wing and see all these pictures of the Madonna and the child, and you're seeing a different kind of growth as the baby is with the mother. There's a growth into that relationship. And of course, in a lot of those pictures, you'll either have the child or the mother, usually the Madonna, usually the mother, looking at you and essentially inviting you into this relationality of the mother and the child, to live inside of this relationality. So this is really what I'm trying to get at, is that the church has its life inside the relationality of what it means to be with the Son, and to continue to find ourselves more deeply in conformity to the Son, and find our life with the Son inside this relationality, as opposed to growth. And yet I think so often we feel decline, and we're more interested in a fertility God. We want our God to be more of a fertility God than the crucified Christ, than the child in the arms of Mary. And so I'm trying to get, I mean, this is not unique for my work, is kind of hitting the same beat of thinking of the relational over the instrumental, and trying to say, like, we encounter God's presence in the relational. And so even growth has to be bound deep in this relational reality. And we always have to be on guard, to your point, like we have to be on guard of the instrumental, of how we use, ways, means, ends, leverage things to get more of something else. And so that's the kind of drumbeat I'm pounding in this book.
Well, I want to keep with Artemis for just a moment, because what I like about the story of Paul in Ephesus is that as he is there and he is speaking and preaching Christ crucified and small, and all these idol makers are going out of business. So people are not buying these Artemis idols anymore, and they're going out of business. They, take him in, they want to throw him in prison. And, the judge said he could go because he's never spoken against this idol. And so I find that interesting. Like today, when we have these idols, like these fertility idols, what does it look like for us to do what you're doing, is point to the relationality of God, and like where we want to be formed into the relationship with God. And this is the actual grow in our relationship. Or is it to like denounce the idol? So can we take an example from Paul of how to speak to the church today?
It's a great point, and one that I didn't work in the book. So
I know, but it was just something I thought of right now. So,
but it's a really great point, because I do think I'm trying to knit together a large enough story in a structural one that, like Paul in Ephesus, I don't think you can become a iconoclastic idol breaker completely. Like, and what I mean by that is, like, for Paul in that world, he can't avoid the pantheon of the Hellenistic and the Roman gods. Like, they're everywhere. So now it's like, well, how do you live distinctively within that? And instead of pointing against them, how do you point to a very different logic, a very different story, a very different thing to be formed into? And I think that's very similar in our perspective. Like, I have some pretty cutting things to say about capital and capitalism, but I'm not an anti-capitalist. And, like, in many ways, I wouldn't be on this podcast if I was completely anti-capitalist. I'm hoping a few people will buy some books, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm very aware I got to move some books to write another book, so, and, if somebody was kind enough to send me an email, invite me to come to their church to to speak at a conference or, at their church, I wouldn't do it for free. Like I would, ask to be paid an honorarium for that. So I'm not an anti-capitalist in any way, but I also think, like Paul, then we have to be hyperly aware of how these things form us and how they form our senses of, well, really our senses of the large story, like what saves us. And I think that's really what I'm kind of getting at here is how do we, even inside a capitalist system, like Paul lives in a society filled with all these Hellenistic gods. How do you live within that society and live for another story, live for another source of what actually saves you? And you're really worshiping the idol when you think what will save you is the fertility god. And in some ways you can't avoid the fertility god. I mean, in that cultural context, I think one of the reasons why Paul's let loose is because he doesn't do the most dangerous thing you could do in any society, which is undercut their narrative of stabilization. So they do think the worship of these gods stabilizes their society. He hasn't spoke against them, so essentially the judge is saying he doesn't put our society that much at threat. I mean, he's got a weird story, and he can go on with that weird story, and I could see how it could be dangerous for whatever, but he hasn't spoken against our system. And I think there's a certain way for us that we have to live inside of these systems, but we also then have to ask ourselves, like, what really do we think saves us? And be really, and I think this is a really hard thing, is we have to know what it means to live inside those structures and be faithful, but keep from a kind of synchronism of blending them together. Because to take us back years, I think that's what Israel does in the days of Elijah and Ahab, is they actually still like Yahweh. They still like Yahweh, who shows up when they're in Egypt and rescues them, but Yahwehism doesn't seem to be getting them where they want to go. And so what if they blend a little Baalism in, like they're trying to keep those things. And Elijah's prophetic move is to say, it's not possible. Don't try. You can't put Baal and Yahweh together. These are two completely different kinds of logics. So you do get a more radical response from Elijah, which is basically like completely down with Baal and completely down with Jezebel. I mean, and the interesting thing about Jezebel is Jezebel's an economist. I mean, we unfortunately have thought of her as like this sexual temptress, and I don't think that's the right way to read her. She's actually a Harvard educated economist, and she's come in to bring a little fertility economic gasoline on this kind of failing Yahwehism. But of course, Elijah's point is Yahweh doesn't work like this. Yahweh doesn't turn people into instruments for gains. Yahweh makes children who are called into rest and into Sabbath. And you can't really blend these things. So it's a big question for pastors, like what, living inside a kind of late capitalist age, what's just the structures you live in, and what has to be opposed? What's a syncretism that you can't, that the gospel will not allow you to blend together? And what is just, what's just having a credit card in your pocket that you like, we honestly couldn't function without, with this, so I think this is the struggle, and helping your people be able to think and make sense inside of those realities, I think is a really difficult thing.
I want to dive into that story a little bit more.
Yeah.
Elijah, First and Second Kings, to walk us through to say how does this enmeshing of Baal and Yahweh that was happening there, how does that start to break apart? So can you just give an overview of these stories?
I'll try. Yeah, I'll try. And my reading is really, not, I hope I'm doing some unique things with the interdisciplinary conversation and aiming it all towards pastoral ministry. But really, my read is very much Brueggemann's read. And therefore, it has all the advantages and all the disadvantages of Brueggemann's read. So it's very much, I think First and Second Kings is very much a prophet's tale. And the priestly class, it kind of, is getting poked in the eye here, and the prophets are the kind of heroes of this. But the idea, I think, really is then this kind of sense of like, is it the word of Yahweh that saves, or is it cultic activity. So if we think of stabilization again, I think ancient people were not capitalists thinking we have to grow our money and our money has to keep growing, but they were thinking that ritualized cult stabilize the society. So you have to have strong gods, and the king is in control of the priestly class and in control of that apparatus, which I think is one of the main reasons why Israel's asked to resist having a king. Because if you have a king, then you have to build this priestly infrastructure, you have to pay taxes to it, and all this stuff starts to occur. And one of the big ones, which we get all these juxtapositions at the beginning of that story, that like David was a good king, and then basically David's a really good king because he has no cultic apparatus. Like he has a very soft cult. The only cult that he has is like the Psalms. Like it's and he always listens to the prophets. Like we're getting a very positive David read, but then Solomon comes about, and the prophet cannot deny Solomon's kingdom is great. Like Solomon is. This is pretty epic golden era kind of experiences, but we then always get these little juxtapositions, like Solomon's, had all these horses and all this stuff, and it was so great. And he married the Pharaoh's daughter and brought her in, so you kind of get both these senses, like he's really great. You can't deny everything he does, but he also starts to blend the worship of Yahweh with other cultic experiences, because that's what happens is when you marry someone, you marry another king's daughter, she brings her cultic practices in, and that's supposed to make you more powerful as king, because now you have all these different cultic realities. But Israel doesn't necessarily think that that's a good thing. That starts to break commandments. But then of course the kingdoms come apart, and then we enter into that period where all the resources do go away. We end up in a great drought. And then we get the story of Ahab. And I always kind of think Kings is interesting because it's like one bad king after another bad king, and then you get some prophets and some pretty cool stories that you got to go back to every year in Sunday school. But then it's just like one bad king after another bad king. And it really is like the slip down from the golden era down to the other side. And I think there is like this trying to race back up the downside of this golden era. And that's when I think the temptation for Baal worship comes, like when you feel that you're losing something, you feel like maybe we need to add a little fertility god in. And that's the kind of reading I'm trying to do, is say like, I think we're kind of on this side as well. But there are these really interesting areas. I mean, so I don't go much further than Elijah, really. I mean, I don't really go much into Elisha, but there is this kind of way where Elijah is just clearly, like, his name means Yahweh is my God. Like, you can't do any syncretism here, like and this God functions in a very different logic. This God does not respond to accelerated forms of cultic practice. This God responds to prayers and humility. Now, granted, Elijah, he flexes a little bit too, and like, is a little bit mocking, but also there's this deep kind of sense where, what does he do? He doesn't dance and do all these cultic activities. He lays on the ground in prayer, and so I'm just trying to raise this different kind of reading of it, and think about how the dynamics of from impossibility comes new possibility. And there's something that radiates with the cross here, is that when, for this God, when all is lost, this God moves, because this God doesn't need any human cultic practice to act. This God only needs the humble heart that prays. It only needs, this is a very Lutheran kind of assertion. It needs not the priest, but the psalmist. Again, I think some scholars would look and like, you can't completely separate those two, because some priests are psalmists too, obviously in the tradition. But there is a kind of read here that I'm a kind of Protestant read even of that story, that I'm trying to think of the one who prays in humility, the one who desires to be embraced by God as Mary embraces her child, as the narrative that saves us, more than thinking, how can we extract resources?
It reminds me of this quote that you have from this book. Prayer is not a device to be used to manifest and therefore control God. Prayer is a way to be before God in need. And the picture of like fertility gods, I have a picture of, I don't know, of a bunch of people around the president praying for, favor for growth and, for all of this stuff, instead of being before God in need. How does Elijah give us this example of what it is to actually pray?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's something, like, I think that's one of the things that's so captivating about that story, and one of the things that's really confusing about it is Elijah somehow ends up, like, in the press briefing with, with Ahab and with Jezebel. You're like, "How did he get in there?" All of a sudden, he's, like, giving a prophetic word, like, "It's not gonna rain anymore," because of this. It's like, how did he, how is he in there? But there's a certain sense that the prophetic move, I think, and what you also see is that then Elijah has to suffer the drought. Like I think sometimes what we do, I guess this is the identitarian in the techno optimist perspective. Like to the story of your picture, or the analogy of your picture, like one is the kind of techno optimist thing. It's like, how do we get near power and leverage power to get the resources we need? And the other is to say, well, I'm gonna it's gonna make a big wave when I, say something, when I confront when I confront power like this. You know what I mean? Like, then everyone's, at least people on my political side, are gonna be like, that's great. But there's something interesting in this story where Elijah, like, the word, the powerful, is woe to you, because the judgment that's coming for you for turning your back on Yahweh and turning your back on the needy is coming for me too. Like, we're both under the judgment. We both need God to act for us. So it's not like Elijah says that word and then gets to escape to green pastures and, pineapples. He I mean, he suffers incredible amounts of pain in the drought. And so there is something I think we have to be really wary of. And you can see how the capitalist perspective plays here is like, if you do it right as an activist, or you do it right as a techno optimist, you'll be able to escape drought. You'll be able to escape suffering. You'll be able to escape the cross. And Elijah's really clear you can't do that. To give the prophetic word also means to bring the word of judgment, means that judgment comes back on you. And the reason God is going to bring a great no is because that no is your no too. So you have, like, I think Elijah says, like when the prophet says, "You've forgotten the poor," they also mean I have forgotten the poor. And woe to me. Like, God is judging me too for having forgot the poor. And so I do think that there's a way that this moves, kind of law, gospel, judgment, grace, that plays within this.
I mean, at the end, God sends Elijah to a dying brook and gets fed by the ravens. Like,
Right.
he's just laying in desolation still.
Yeah, and then God sends, after that, sends him to a mother who's starving to death, and you get this the bread just keeps coming, but then the child that's saved by this miracle dies, and this mother, to her credit, is absolutely angry. Like, what? Your God saved me? Like, her whole plan was to have one last meal with her son, and then they would die together. And at least she was in control of her destiny. And then Elijah saves her, or his God saves her, and then her son dies anyhow. And he feels like this is an utter curse. But then, of course, we get that story that really echoes Jesus' own healing of Jairus' daughter, where Elijah goes in and holds the boy, and he lives again, and he brings resurrection. So you get this whole sense, like, out of nothingness, death, brokenness, the echo of the cross, this God of Israel moves. This God is not dependent on fertility. This God is dependent actually on the opposite of that. Like, where you can start to anticipate this God will work and move is where things are desolate, where you are far from a golden era. Like, when we're in a golden era, that's where we should start to be a little bit worried. That's when we start to, like, we can get confused here and think that this God functions this way, or that it's us who did this or something. Like, we can, when times are good, and who doesn't want good times? I mean, we all want good times, but there is a deep, maybe this is what leads someone like Friedrich Nietzsche to think like Christianity is utter cancerous, because it's a little bit like, when things are going good, you better be careful. Like, but there is something true about that, because this God is a minister. This God is a God who comes in to death and brings life. This is a God who comes to need. This is what this God does. This God cares for the needy. It's a big question for us. We all need to sustain. We all need sustainability and the continuation of our communities. But that can't come in the opposite logic of this God who comes to the needy and to the brokenhearted.
I don't know how much hope you're giving me. You're not giving me the hope of the techno optimist or any optimism in the growth of like new movement or a stable life or, constant, escalation for the stabilization. You're giving me hope in something deeper that's going to be with me in the suffering, that I can wait with God in the middle of suffering, which is hopeful in one sense, but in this earthly American sense, it just feels totally counterintuitive.
Well, and I think it's ultimate hope, because really what it is you're going to have enough. This God will give you enough, that like the rain will come, the small cloud will occur, but it's not going to come from your effort. It's not going to come from your control. It's going to come as pure gift. And so the question is, are our communities prepared to receive the gift of God's presence, the gift of God's act? Or are we thinking we got to get our capital in order and we got to find ways? I mean, there's a certain way that capital itself becomes its own God, because capital can grow itself. Like what do we all want? We want our 401ks to have enough principal in them that they just grow without having to do anything. They're self-perpetuating forms of growth. And this is where we're kind of trapped, because none of us can really retire without fiscal capitalism and its growth markets. But at the same time, it does start to form us in a way to think money is more powerful than God. Capital is more powerful than God, because it acts, and your God waits and waits and waits until you are in deep need, and then reveals God's self and saves.
Yeah. I mean, you turn in your final chapter, you turn to Mary, and then you argue that the Magnificat, the Mary song, is essentially counter-economic vision of the kingdom. This, I think, is a place where maybe I could find some hope that I'm seeking. What are you saying about Mary? What can we learn as a anti-Baal type of posture?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it really echoes that very different reality where Mary, it's all about the relationality and not about the extraction of resources. Like, this is why in the tradition there's something I think really significant about remembering, claiming the creedal claim of the Virgin Mary. I mean, in many ways, she stands outside the fertility structure. You know what I mean? Like, the fact that she has this child in her arms as Virgin Mary means that this is pure gift, that this is the act of God, that she's the recipient of the great gift, that she even says in the Magnificat that she's the blessed one, but there's also something deeply prophetic here that Luther, and I'm kind of dealing with Luther's commentary on the Magnificat here, that Luther wants to say, and he's writing it to the elector, like his ruler's nephew, where he's like, God takes those who are high and tears them down and lifts up the lowly. Like, this is what is happening here, is that those who don't have, through this person that is going to be born in the womb of this teenage girl, that the needy will be given what they need, and those who are high will be torn down. And it's an incredible prophetic statement. And Mary teaches us to believe this word, like that's what Luther really wants to do, is extract Mary. Melanchthon wants to get rid of Mary. Luther's sidekick is like, there's too much superstition in this. Let's get rid of this. I mean, this is kind of how some Lutherans and some Reformed people, I think, and American Protestants feel too. Is like, just that's way too Catholic for us. But Luther doesn't want to get rid of Mary, but he wants to extract Mary out of some cultic system and place her as our teacher, the one who hears the word and responds, the true response of faith, this true faithful one that hears God's word and responds to it and recognizes that God comes to the lowly, that God cares for the lowly, that God comes to the brokenhearted and the lost, and that this is what God is going to do for all of creation, that those who cry and are in pain, God is going to come and minister life to them. And those who have won the gambit of power and of escalating growth. And I think we should all fear this in some sense. All of us middle class Americans, God's going to bring them down. That judgment and that grace comes to us through Mary in that way. But it is this emphasis of the relationality, I think, over the instrumental.
Well, then speak to the church at the moment on all sides of us being caught up in all of these fertility idols. One of the things you just talked about is hearing and obeying God's word, of doing that. How do we resolve to do that? How do we stay faithful to be able to hear and obey?
Yeah, I mean, there's practices that have to put us there. We have to read the scriptures, which I hope this book represents. Like it actually lives that out. But we have to learn to be praying people. But there's a deep sense, I think, that what it means to receive that gift is to recognize that at the kind of vertical level, there's nothing we can do. There's no way we can fulfill God's ought. God gifts us God's grace and fulfills that ought. But once that ought is fulfilled, and this is a very kind of Bonhoeffer, Luther kind of perspective again, you go to your neighbor and you care for your neighbor. So what the church needs to do is exactly what Elijah does, is go to this mother and be with her. And there's a deep sense of doing that. I mean, there's this line from Luther that's so beautiful where he says, God doesn't need your good works. God doesn't need them, but your neighbor does. Your neighbor needs your good works. So the question is, can we go to our neighbor to meet Jesus Christ who is with and for our neighbor? But can we do that not as a form of techno-optimism? There's an initiative here that we can extract some goods out of, or as a way of winning likes for our form of activism. Like, you know what I mean? Like that, being here in the Twin Cities, I watch so many people faithfully act in the midst of January and February and all the craziness that was going on. But there are a lot of people who acted and did incredibly beautiful things, and those never went online because they were just being faithful to their community. They were just responding to their neighbors. They weren't thinking, I have to put this online. I have to see how many likes I can get. And I'm not even saying that everyone did that, who put stuff on Facebook or whatever, did that because they were thinking, I need to win in the attention economy. I'm not saying that, but I am saying these are things we have to think about pastorally. Like, what does it mean to keep the primary people that you're responsible to is the bodies that are before you, the people you've been called to, the office you bear as their pastor, that those are the primary people you're responsible to, not a bunch of social media people that might feel really good for them to be like, oh, that's such a great sermon, or what a great take, that really helps me think about this. But that is a certain way of playing into the fertility cult, to be quite honest, inside this third industrial revolution of personality capital. So I think this is a big formative question for pastors, is like, how do we escape this kind of personality capital and capitalism? And I think it will probably mean taking steps away from social media, which, performative contradiction, as people are watching this on social media, or from their podcast feed or whatever. I mean, these are the tensions we live in. But I think people like us have to really honor the pastor who just walks the road with these people and is simply with and for them, and isn't really concerned about what someone in Wichita, Kansas thinks, or someone in, San Francisco thinks. They're just simply going to do what's called for, to be with their neighbors and to call their community to see and be with their neighbors and find Jesus Christ, who is with and for our neighbor.
Do you see what was happening in January and February in the Twin Cities, the community coming together and looking out for one another? Does that continue now? Is it something that we're saying, oh, this is actually how we live going forward, and it wasn't just for a moment?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I do think so. I think that the intensity is less, therefore the attention is less. It's moved on to other things. But I know a lot of pastors and ministries that are just that they're still walking the road with people and are still being faithful in their neighborhood. And I think there's a lot of people, this is the weird part of the country where you throw a rock, you hit a Lutheran. You know what I mean? It's one of the only places in the country where that's true. But there is a deep sense of what it means to attend to your neighbor. And I do think you saw, whether that was just a kind of civic religion, kind of leftover allure of an old kind of 20th century Christendom that was, has been slowly disappearing since 1970. But there was a certain way it framed people's imaginations, so people did stand with their neighbors, and yet it comes with a lot of complication too, and I hope this book kind of doesn't shy away from the complication, but does call us. It's a kind of theology of the cross, growth in light of the theology of the cross.
Well, this is a fantastic book, Baal and the Gods of More. It'll be available anywhere books are sold. People could go and get this book and then buy the rest of your books and just, sit with
and then escalating growth of my sales. Yeah.
I'm going to escalate your growth and just more. Just buy more, do more. Right. We just want more. That's good. Yeah. Andy, I love this. I'd love to get a recommendation or two from you. Anything you've been watching or reading lately you could recommend?
Well, we watched the first episode, Steve Carell show on HBO. The Rooster, I think it's called.
The Rooster. That was good, wasn't it?
Oh, it was awesome. We have the second episode we're going to watch tonight, but I'm a little bit nervous about watching it because then we're done. Then we got to wait till Sundays for them to come. But gosh, it seems like it's going to be really good. Yeah. And when the pilot is that good, I'm pretty excited about that.
So I think anything Bill Lawrence does lately, I mean, he's Ted Lasso, Shrinking, scrubs his back, which he had, and Rooster, he has a hand in it too, and it feels a little Bill Lawrence-y to me, which I love.
We really loved it. So that would be probably TV show. And book, I don't know, I'm working on a project, and I picked up an oldie but a goodie that I think people need to give a guy by the name of James Loder more of a read. And he wrote a book called The Logic of the Spirit, which is it's not an easy read. It's not terribly difficult, but he's just a really unique thinker. And I just read that again. I mean, this is 1998, so I'm not breaking anything new here, but he's not been read as much as he should. And so his books, The Transforming Moment and The Logic of the Spirit, I think are worth people finding again.
Great. Well, once again, Baal and the Gods of More will be available anywhere. It's a fantastic book. Thank you so much, Andy. This is a great conversation.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.